Greetings! Today I'm going to talk about mixing acoustic drum kits and how I go about it and my method for getting a consistent and punchy sound. I'm basically going to show how I go from this raw drum recordings to this. And hopefully still get some pretty competitive results out of that, basically. I'm also going to try and do this mostly using plugins that are just built into Logic, but if you have spicy third-party plugins of your own, feel free to use them. I will be using a couple in this process. I'm not going to be talking about how you record or how to mic up drums, because I think that's kind of a separate topic in a separate video. This is literally just about how to treat them once you've got the recordings into software. So some starting information. These are drum recordings by my good pal Barney Sage. And these are the drum stems for one of our tracks called Sanity Meter. These drums are actually all recorded by Barney himself, and I can't remember exactly what microphones he had set up, but you can see that there's only 7, and he would have used this just plugged into something like a Focusrite Scala 18 in 20 out, I think is what he used. But nothing like, there's no preamp gear, there's no compressors, there's no like crazy outboard studio stuff happening on this. It is literally just mics plugged into an audio interface. I've dragged the audio files in to a blank session in Logic, and I'll just give you a little playthrough so you can get a sense of what they sound like unmixed. So these are the raw unmixed drum files. Just going to skip to a point a little bit further on where he's playing some toms, so you can hear what the toms sound like as well. So yeah, it's actually a pretty good kit sound to start with, but you can hear that it's kind of flat and there's like, it could probably have a little bit more like punch and impact, right? So I have a specific order that I always do things in. So it goes kick, snare, high tom, low tom, overhead left, overhead R, and the room mic. And then I always color code my kick in red and any other drum elements in yellow. To begin with, my process is that I go through the kick, snare and tom mics, and I'm going to start this process of isolating the mics and doing a bit of basic cleanup. The very first thing that you should check before you add any plugins or do any leveling is just check that all the mics are at a good input level. And the way that you do that is if you click this little region top down up here, you've got this gain adjustment, and you can see here that I'm affecting how loud those audio tracks are, and you basically want these at like healthy levels. What I mean by that is like peaking at around -6 on these meters or so. But it's just basically where it's pushing the yellow but without clipping or going red, kind of like at a decent volume. Yeah, you want to make sure that that's set before you add any plugins in. Is everything playing back together at that volume will probably make the stereo output clip. And this is normal, there's a way to deal with that, but you actually want all the tracks quite loud. And just turn that down to start with by about, you can go -12 dB to start with. I'm going to systematically go through each mic and basically just do a bit of tidying up and isolation on them, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So I'm going to start with a bit of basic, what I'd call surgical or cleanup EQ. And you want to do a basic sort of low pass on the kick just to filter out. I like to do a small boost at around 8K with a bell, and that brings out some of the click of the beater of the mic. I mean, really not a lot. It's pretty minimal processing at this point. It's just to do a tiny bit, right? The next thing that I'd like to do is put a kind of what I'd call like a character EQ on that. The vintage tube EQ, which is kind of like call it a Pultec style EQ. And you can do the Pultec trick on these types of EQs, this Pultec style. You've got a boost and you've got a attenuation control. You'll hear that what this does is kind of like reshapes the low end of the kick in a particular way. And then attenuate. So that might be a little bit too much in context, but it's just a starting place for now to kind of improve that kick mic sound. So moving on to the next step, I like to gate the kick so that you're basically getting rid of the bleed of the other hits and just isolating it down to just the kick channel. And then the last thing that I might do is just basically put a gentle bit of compression on that, which will flatten out these peaks here, reduce the volume of some of those peaks so they're more in line with the quiet ones, or sort of boost everything up a little bit, just so that looks slightly more uniform, but not like to a ridiculous extent. So that's too much. Just something like that, so it kind of tickles the compressor and it just kind of tucks those peaks in a bit. The idea is to simply just repeat that process on the snare and the tom mics, right? Don't really need to on this microphone, but I do tend to filter out some of the lows below the kick. So that's pretty isolated, and the snares can often be quite a bit easier to isolate than other mics, but yeah, in combination now. But yeah, you can hear I've kind of been careful there to not lose the ghost notes of the snare. That's important, so we want to be able to keep that, because that's quite important, especially to a drummer like Barney who uses a lot of ghost notes. So yeah, we're still catching those because it's important to maintain those essentially. So yeah, now moving on to the toms. It's pretty much the same process with the toms, but the thing about tom mics is I think often because of their position in relation to the rest of the kit, I think the tom mics don't sound good apart from the actual tom hits themselves, and to leave the whole rest of it in context with the rest of the kit can find it makes things a bit of a pain to get the best sound out of it. It just kind of muddies up and gives you less control. And the other thing is, you can see in this microphone that the tom hits here, they basically are as loud as the snare. Yeah, basically I'm not going to be able to get rid of that with gating because, well, there might be a trick to do it, but I think the way that I usually just deal with toms is to basically cut out all the bits in the mics. That's a snare hit there, so I'm actually going to get rid of that. And then let's just get rid of all of that. And then yeah, you can put some slight fade outs on these tom hits. And yeah, it's a little bit of a pain in the arse, but I will literally go through every single moment in the song and I'll chop out the tom hits so that I don't have the rest of that mic in context with it. You can see I've cut it down here to just be tom hits when they're needed. So if I go to over here, and then yeah, you can basically now pan these individually. And where I was doing that before, you can just get some weird stuff when you're hearing like the other hi-hats and the rest of the kit like panning around differently. So I think that's one reason why. I actually think, yeah, they could do with a little bit more. You can put a gate on them after that to kind of clean that up a little bit more, because that sounds a bit weird. But in context, once the overheads are in, you're not really going to notice it, basically. So yeah, I haven't done any EQ on these yet. Let's maybe do a little bit of that now. I'm probably just going to Pultec them quickly. I tend to process these as a group. It basically now at this point makes sense if I start going into my grouping setup that I use to mix drums. By default, all of your tracks, when you import audio into Logic or any DAW, you can see that all of their outputs are set to the stereo output. So basically all of these just go in a straight line to the stereo out, right? And the way that you control the relationships between them is just by using the faders. But this is pretty limited, and basically if you have everything, absolutely everything just going to the stereo out, I think it's just very difficult to stay on top of and make sense of. So what you would need to do is create some buses, and the way to do this is to send, if you go to where it says stereo output on the kick track here, so if I also hit the mixer, go to the kicks output, and if I change the output of that track to, I'm going to set that to bus 1, you can see that turns up here. It's called aux 1 and there. So I'm going to name that in capital letters kick, and then if I right click that and press create track, you see it creates a track for it here, and that lives under my kick bus. Now I really want to stress how this is very different to using a send. So if you go to send and then bus 1 and you do that, basically what you're doing is you're creating 2 copies of that track. So if I solo the kick, you can see how I'm hitting -6.7 on the stereo out, and if I send that to a bus and then I solo that, you see how I'm now significantly louder on the stereo out because I've basically just created 2 copies of that kick signal, and that's not what I want. I want the audio of this track to feed into the kick bus, and then that kick bus goes directly to the output. We're going to do this for each group of mics that we have. So if you had more kick microphones, like a kick in and a kick out, you would send them both to this singular kick bus here, and then you'd be able to control the level of both those microphones at once with this fader here. So that gives you some control. And I'm just going to go through and do this for all of my instrument groups. Toms here both go to one singular bus. We call that toms. And then the overheads here both go to their O's bus here. And then the kick mic goes to its own bus here. The room mic, sorry, goes to its own. Okay, so now if I, for example, adjust this O's track, you'll see that it will turn down both of these microphones at the same time. So rather than having to highlight both and do that, or for example, automate both tracks, you know, like that, you can achieve the same effect by just doing that on one track. So it just helps to kind of keep things a bit neater, and find when you've got loads of tracks and they've all got automation happening on them, it just becomes a bit of a nightmare. Keep track of what you're looking at and, you know, managing your song as it gets bigger. I'm going to pan the overheads hard left and hard right. So that's how you can kind of start blending the different mics and the different elements of the kit and leveling things a little bit more easily. Obviously I've isolated the kick mics of these quite a bit, which has cleaned up the sound, and it would have cleaned up a lot of muddiness that might interfere later on. But the overheads are going to be pretty important because they're like the real voice of the kit, if you like. So we only need to do a little bit to these. I generally just do some low cut, because you don't really need all of this low end information. It's coming from the close mic of the kick. The other thing with overheads, sometimes when you pan things hard left and hard right, you get that really nice width, but then the kit feels like really spread out, and like the drummer's got fucking cymbal on the other side of the stage, and then a tom's coming from over here, and it's just a bit like, I tend to sort of shrink things in a bit, not totally monoize it, but just shrink down the stereo image so it's not quite as spread out. And I usually use this free plugin by Flux SE called Stereo Tool. This has got this little width control in it, and I usually just bring that in a little bit like that, and it's subtle, but it just helps to suck the center image back into the kit. A mono image can just help them sound fatter if it's too wide. So if I really exaggerate it and go the other way, and then we've got the room mic, so I'm just going to basically mute that, and then I'm going to gradually bring it up in volume and set it somewhere just as you start to hear what it does to the rest of the kit. So yeah, the idea is to kind of like turn it up so that it's too loud and then back it off to taste, or where you think you like the sound of it, and where it feels like it's kind of beefing up the kit sound underneath that and the close mics without kind of overpowering the nice direct transients that you're getting from these mics, basically. So yeah, again, on the room mic, it's basically just making sure that there's no super stupid, low rumbly stuff under like 20 hertz that's going to interfere with the other mics or your overall mix. So let's compress the fuck out of a room mic.
Nice.
Basically smash it with compression, like to a ridiculous degree, then turn it down really quiet and fold it in under the rest of the drum mix, and you'll hear what it, like, you know, does a thing, as you might say. Another thing that we can do is start to add some effects to our snare here. Rather than doing it on the snare track, if you go to the snare bus, and now we can go to the send, create a bus here, and the reason I left gaps in my list of buses here is so that I can neatly put a snare reverb bus under the snare here. I'm going to call that snare RVB, and I've got a snare reverb track here, and I'm just going to put a basic, something like chroma verb on this. So I'm only affecting the snare, which is really nice. It's quite a clean way to set up that effect. The additional advantage of having your snare reverb set up on its own bus like this, you can adjust the volume of the snare reverb in relation to the dry snare pretty easily, as opposed to like, so for example, you could just put the snare, you know, you can put the snare reverb on the snare track like that. And you could automate the dry wet of it like that if you wanted to control the volume of it. I just prefer doing it on a bus because you can kind of see, having it on its own channel that's separate, I don't know, it just helps for me, my kind of like managing what's going on here and how it looks. And the other advantage is, of course, if you put that reverb effect on the snare mic channel, let's say this reverb didn't have this EQ in it and I wanted to EQ the reverb. If I put an EQ plugin, you know, after that reverb here, I'm going to be affecting the dry snare as well as the reverb, which I don't want to do. I want to have the snare, the dry snare, stay how it is, but process the reverb separately. So that's how you do that, is you have it set up on a different bus like that. So that's pretty useful. I like to often layer in an additional kick from a software hack like Addictive Drums or something. And it's very, very easy to do that in Logic. So for example, if you click on an audio region like that, say if it's a kick, and you go, I've cut it out the screen, but if you go to track at the top of the screen and you hit this replace or double drum track, and if you select kick mode, what Logic's just done is created a MIDI region underneath the kick. And if you mess about this threshold, you can see that controls the sensitivity of the detection of where it's thinking that a kick is being played, basically. So you want to kind of eyes it up and check that it's getting every single kick hit in. And then if you hit OK, and you can see what Logic's done there, it's created a MIDI version of the kick transients, but it's assigned a built-in Logic kick sample to it. So just to start with, that now sounds like this. And I can now assign any kick sample that I want to that, and it will be perfectly in time with what Barney played. The thing about this is it often doesn't get the detection totally right, and especially if your drummer has like a speedy right foot and does a lot of doubles, but sometimes it doesn't always get that right, essentially. It might miss hits out or misinterpret a tom hit as a kick hit. So the next part of the process is you basically have to go through this very finely and just make sure that there is actually a MIDI note. So you have to make sure that is all in sync with what the drummer actually played. And the next thing to do is, you can see Logic's kind of done it, but yeah, what it will also do is it will give you a specific velocity. It will try to match the velocity of each hit based on the level of, you know, the hits in the kick microphone. And that can sometimes give you really, really like disparate results. So, you know, you might get that like that. And let me just show you why that's bad. Because so if it's a full velocity hit, if it's a full red like that, you can see that that is almost clipping. Not quite, but So some of those hits could potentially just, that's not good, basically. It's difficult to control. So the next thing to do is to highlight every single note. You can do that with Command A. Highlight every hit, go to Functions, MIDI Transform, Fixed Velocity, and then if you hit Operate, you can see it basically just knock those all to orange. And as a basic way of explaining this, I think that you only need 2 colors for your drum trigger. You need orange and blue. So orange is for a full stroke, full loudness hit, and then where you've got these little like double kicks, obviously the way that a double kick technique happens with the slide foot technique or whatever, the first hit is always usually a little bit quieter than the second one. So you just have to go through the take, and where any doubles are, you just want to adjust the velocity down, right? So you can hear that's kind of robotic, that boom, boom, boom. So just to make it a bit more natural again, you just drag that down. And yeah, I will tend to basically go through the MIDI like that for the whole song, highlight where I see every double, and then with them all highlighted, if you adjust them as one, they'll all go down to the same uniform volume. And yeah, that can take a while depending on how much your drummer plays the bass drum and how long your song is. And I don't like using sampler. I have addictive drums, so I'm going to load that up for my kick sound. So yeah, I've got a lot more tonal control over what kind of kick sound that I want now, whereas before with that kick mic, I'm basically limited to the sound of what it sounds like. I can't really change it. You can put compression and EQ and stuff on it, or distortion, and obviously do some things, but you cannot completely transform the recording of what you've got, basically. So I find this is quite fun because you can really change like the vibe or the tone of what you've gone for a bit later in the day. So that's cool because I think it just gives you a lot more control over the sound of the bass drum, and I'll just be able to get a better sound out of it. You know, I'm not vastly transforming the entire sound of the recorded drum mix because you still got the natural overheads and the room mic sound, right? It's just helping to beef things up, and it just gives me more control. And yeah, essentially the process is to do the same thing with the snare. So the principle with doing the snare is all I want is the main snare accents to be layered. I don't want all the ghost notes getting layered with a sample layer, it's just those main hits. And yeah, don't mute the snare mic. This is always a layering thing because I want to keep those ghost notes that Barney played and the actual the real ones that he did. And then I'm just going to beef up his main snare accents with a layered hit. And the idea is to just blend it up in alongside the snare to kind of give it a bit more thwack and character, essentially. So. If you wanted to, you could do the same thing with the toms and add trigger layers to those, but I tend to actually just leave them alone. So the next thing is to create our final master drums buses, and what I tend to do is highlight every single group except the kick. So you can see I've got all of these highlighted and they're going to the stereo out. What I'm going to do, I'm going to send this to a bus and call it all drums. All drums is everything except the kick mics. The reason for that is because I like to process things separately. So for example, I want to be able to put reverb on all the drums, but not the kick, because I don't want the kick getting all of that like low end. I don't want it to ring out. I just want it to have like that quite dry, dead sound. Okay, so you've got this all drums bus. And you see everything is ending up here. So it's gotten a bit loud, but yeah, if I mute this, so that's everything except the kick, and that enables me to, for example, send that to all drums reverb. Again, just use chroma verb for that. So that's going to live under here. nice crack that you get out of having a bit of reverb on all the drums. I mean, if I send the kick to the all drums bus, and now what happens is the kick, the dry kick, and the rest of everything all meet up on a bus here, which is called Dr. Sum. And this is an abbreviation for drum sum, not the name of some sort of numerical based crime lord. So now we finally have a master fader for our entire drum kit. So if I want to adjust the level of everything all together all at once, I can do that here. And yeah, you know, I could automate the entire kit at once. Becomes very easy and simple to do that because it's all just happening on the one group or one track here, rather than me obviously having to do that individually, create a line of automation for every single one of these tracks, which would be long. But we're not done yet. Couple more things to do. So I want to put a parallel compressor on all of my drums. So to do that, I create a bus on my Dr. Sum here, drums, parallel comp, and now I'm going to put a compressor like I did for the room mic earlier, but instead I'm going to do it to the entire drum signal with all the reverb and all the processing that I've done. So that's very, very silly. But yeah, having that just quietly folded in with the rest of the drums mix. But yeah, then again, the same problem as before. If I want to control the whole kit volume now, I can't. I'd have to automate the Dr. Sum and the drums parallel compression. So in order to, you know, do something like that, you have to do the exact same thing on 2 tracks, which is really annoying. So instead of doing that, highlight the Dr. Sum and the drums parallel comp, and we're now going to send these to the final true drums bus. I'm going to call that drum sum, create track, and that is our final drums group here, right? So yeah, so you can see obviously when I'm playing through, it now becomes very easy to see where there's a problem. So if anything's clipping, it's very easy to just visually see that right now. Last couple things that I would like to put on that are, I've got this pretty spicy plugin, Gain Station by Mike Dean Mike. The way that I use this, if I grab the output knob and I set that to -6, then it basically means no matter what I do in this plugin, level here is never going over that. It's never going over -6. And then what I can basically do is raise up the volume of the kit quite dramatically, and it will get very loud, but it will never go over -6 technically on the meter. So you can get things really fucking loud. And you can hear that as I push that clipper up into this threshold that I've set, the kit gets louder, but you can hear as I start to push it, it will distort and kind of break up. I kind of like to set it where it just starts to do that and just gives it a little bit of a tickle of drive. Yeah, this basically helps the drum signal to get as loud as you can possibly get it, and it also gives it a little bit of this saturation character, which I think is really, really, really nice. So this will get loud, so watch your ears here. But yeah, you might have noticed there that that got incredibly loud and got louder and louder in volume, but it never ever went over that value on the meter, which is like a really important trick with clipping, basically. Do it with something different. So let's use K-Clip by Kazrog. And essentially, same deal here. You've got an input knob and an output knob. And if I set that output knob to about -6, and then I drive the input above that, you'll see that it gets louder, and as you turn it up it distorts more, but it never goes over -6. And the idea is obviously to just boost it up where it gets loud and starts to can see there that I've square waved it, and I think that that's probably too much for acoustic drums. So yeah, now I can kind of just start, you know, if I have some other track stems in context with the drum mix like this, now this is the point where I can kind of start really shaping how the drums sound around everything else that I've recorded. So yeah, pretty different to having everything just going straight to the stereo out. So yeah, without all of that routing, obviously it'd be really difficult to sort of control the sound of the kit and like its relationships with the rest of the track. So I hope some of that has been useful or at least interesting to some people. Do give me a shout if there's anything else I've not quite covered or you want me to touch on anything in a little bit more detail. I'd be happy to do that. But yeah, take it easy and catch you next time. Cheers.